Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along. My name's Nathan Hall. I'm one of the associate heads here at ICJS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this, the second of a series of events that we are hosting to mark the 25th anniversary of the Institute of Criminal Justice Studies. Dorman here. Before I forget to mention it, we're going to the brew house after this with Tim, if anyone wants to come and join us for a drink.
For a glass of water.
For a glass of water, absolutely. So as I say, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. About 2 or 3 months ago, when Francis, who's organising these events, asked me if I'd be happy to introduce today's speaker, I was obviously more than happy to do that, not least because there are fewer tasks as easy as introducing somebody who needs no introduction. But bear with me for a moment or two. So we're working today, Tim Newburn from the LSE, to students, not just our students, but students around the country. Tim is the man who has produced the book on which it seems all post-2007 undergraduate degrees are based. To the rest of us, of course, Tim is one of the eminent scholars of our field, and with the exception of the one book that I've just mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong here, my counting sort of slowed down a bit, is the author of 188 other scholarly publications, which is a remarkable achievement, made even more incredible by the fact he's done all of this while supporting Everton. So
It's been nice.
That's why we're standing by the door. But it's a real pleasure to introduce Tim. Tim has been a good friend to the Institute and indeed to many of us who work here over the 25 years that we've been in existence. So I will hand over to Tim, and thank you so much for coming along. And if we can welcome Tim to talk.
So Nathan, thank you for the kind words. No, they were almost entirely kind, obviously, apart from that little sniper Everton. But no, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. My thanks too to Francis, who, as Nathan said, has been organising these talks and who emailed me a while back and sent the invitation to come here today. It's a real pleasure once again to be in Portsmouth. So first of all, congratulations. Congratulations to the Institute for its 25 years. It's an extraordinary achievement. Just as we were standing here a little earlier on setting up PowerPoint and having a bit of a chat, we were talking a little bit about the student numbers here, which are just extraordinary, really. You know, by any standards, that's an awful lot of undergraduate and postgraduate students studying some variant of what we might broadly call criminology, let's call it that. But policing studies and security, criminal justice and so forth. It's a huge achievement. And so in particular, my congratulations to Steve Savage, who started this whole thing off, has been here all the way through, and of course, and crucially, is a fellow Evertonian. We must always stick together, us Burconians. So my thanks are also to Francis for the title. So I was invited, Francis said, maybe you'd like to come and talk about the riots and riots research that you were involved in. And we had a bit of a to and fro, and said, yes, and fine, and we organised the dates. And Francis very kindly said, well, perhaps you could put the 25 years in the title, because that's what we're doing as the theme, and sent me a kind of putative title for a talk. And we didn't change it at all, and that's it. So if it works, it's all Francis is doing, and if it doesn't work, it's my fault for not living up to the title. So 25 years of riots research, reading riots locally and globally, is what I'm going to talk about. More particularly in my, 40 minutes or so, kind of looking back, what I want to do is say a little bit about riots, obviously, and so look back at the last, actually, to be fair, it's not really 25 years I'm going to look up a little bit longer than 25 years, but 25 years for the title and 35 or 40 maybe for the talk, but incorporating the 25. So a little bit looking back at riots, and then looking back at riots research. So I want to talk about, just a little bit about what people have, how social scientists, I guess, have approached some of the questions around civil disorder, urban violence, riots, whatever we might, collective violence, whatever we might call these kinds of things. And then what I want to do really is just, in a very kind of straightforward way, suggest that there are some remaining limitations, I think, in this field. There's a huge amount of really good work, but I do think that the field is hamstrung slightly in a couple of ways that I'll argue. And I think maybe there's a case for sort of slightly changing our approach to the way in which we think about these events. Well, not necessarily all that majorly, but a slight reorientation. And I'll explain what I mean by this in due course. But I want to talk about what I've been calling, it's a bit of a clunky term, but anyway, the life cycle of riots. And I want to look at these things both domestically, and I'll use some international illustrations as well, kind of very briefly, just to kind of give some colour or flavour to the points that I want to make. And that's it, really. And then we'll go to the pub. So, first and foremost, we're a riotous island from one perspective. So this is the last, whatever this is, 37 years. But this is the kind of urban riots. This begins with St Paul's in Bristol, which was the first big urban riot of the 1980s, swiftly followed a year later by probably, in some ways, the most famous of all the urban riots of modern times in England, which is the Brixton Riot of 1981. Most famous, I think, because of the Scarman report that was written in its aftermath. But this is a list of the kind of, it's not a complete one by any means, but an illustrative list of the major urban disorders of the last 37 years, as I say, beginning with St Paul's and going through the 81 riots in Brixton, Liverpool, Manchester and so forth, through to Broadwater Farm, the student demonstrations, the race riots of 2001, poll tax riot, and ending up with 2011. The riots that occurred in London initially, and then spread to Birmingham, to Manchester, to Liverpool, Salford, and in some small cases beyond that too. And it's those riots that, in a sense, kicked off or sparked my interest in collective disorder. So one of my very first jobs as a postgraduate student was working on a research project looking at collective disorder, on a historical project, looking at collective disorder in England between the turn of the 19th, 20th century and 1975. And I worked on that for a couple of years, and then I kind of moved on and not abandoned interest, but didn't do any further research in that field for a very long time. And then really quite serendipitously became involved in a project in 2011 with the Guardian newspaper, looking at the 2011 riots, a project we call Reading the Riots. And it's one or two little elements of that I'll refer to in talking about these things today. So that's kind of what it looks like, I think. Look, I was looking back on riots briefly. I'll come back to them in a moment. Looking back on riots research, what the shape of riots, the talk about riots looks like. Well, on the one hand, I think there's a kind of split in some ways in the discourses around riots and disorder. A split in the political discourses around riots and disorder, and a split in academic discourse too. And that the split, whether it's a political one or an academic one, I think is largely around the issue of rationality. It's how do we understand the conduct of the people involved, the people out on the streets involved in disorder? Are they, from one perspective, mindless, atavistic animals who've lost all control under the sway of the mob? They've lost sight of the difference between right and wrong. They're carried away by this kind of collective excitement and sentiment, behaving in ways which otherwise they wouldn't do. Or actually, is this the kind of the reaction of the dispossessed, the unemployed, the downtrodden, those who are subject to discrimination, to racism, to kind of broad forms of disenfranchisement? Are riots the expression of the anger that's caused as results from their grievances, the very specific grievances that they have and they experience as a result of their social, political and cultural position? And I think you see that split running through, as I say, both political discourse, politicians who would dismiss collective violence as simply the mob. David Cameron's phrase in the 2011 riots, criminality pure and simple. Yeah? That's all it was. You needn't understand it in any other way. All those politicians who would then take issue and who would point to whatever it might be, social exclusion and unemployment and racism and so forth, and use that as the basis for their explanation of riots. And we see, I think, precisely the same kind of divide, much subtler in a variety of ways, but within academic discourse too, I think. There is less of the kind of classic, old-fashioned psychological position associated with Gustave Le Bon and so forth, and that school of the late 19th century, which saw collective conduct and crowds as animalistic and atavistic and something of a throwback and so forth. But nonetheless, there is still, I think, buried within elements of the academic talk about riots, still some sense that there is a debate between those on the one hand who would see this as more or less a reflection of the political positions, or the political, social and economic positions of those involved, and those who actually see it as not a reflection of that at all, but of something more immediate, more emotional, something more of an immediate reaction to the position that they're in. So that, I think, and I'll come back to this a couple of times, it's only a little postage stamp reflection on some of the sort of scholarly and political debate about riots. But I do think it's quite an important schism, quite an important division. But more than that, what this all, I think, tells us, or tells me, is that fundamentally, most of us who've done research in this field have been concerned with one question. It's actually a little more than that, but put it crudely, it's what causes riots. Riots happen. What bends us all out of shape when riots happen is, why did it happen? That's what we want to know. It's a perfectly reasonable and sensible question, and I think it's an obvious one to ask. Of course you would want to know why riots happen. But as I'll come on to in a little while, I want to suggest that it's not entirely helpful to focus all our attentions and efforts, our energies, in trying to answer that question. So just going back to these riots, what if anything pins them together? Well, apart from some violence, a few things possibly. In the main, but not in all cases, this disorder, these riots, these things occurred in poor, disenfranchised, marginalized communities. They involved people who certainly, when asked, if they were ever asked, expressed some sense of marginalization and alienation. They were people who tend to feel separate from the mainstream political process, who feel in some way either under or unrepresented in mainstream politics, whose interests they feel are certainly not as visible in mainstream central governmental or even local governmental politics as they may be. In many of these cases, but again by no means all, racism is a fairly common theme, certainly running through the 1980s riots, also in 2011, and some of those in between. But again, not all, I would say. And the third thing that maybe ties them together is policing, is the role of the police. The police are, in a sense, it would be very odd to have a riot without policing involved in some kind of way. This is a major breakdown in order. Who's likely to respond? The police. But the police are here visible in at least three ways, I think. First of all, in almost all cases, if there's an identifiable flashpoint, so social scientists tend to quite often use this metaphor of a spark or a flashpoint in trying to make sense of what turns a relatively orderly or moderately disorderly situation into a riot. Usually the thought is, in many circles, that there's some kind of spark, some kind of flashpoint, the tinder, that gets the fire really going. Well, what does the flashpoint tend to be? Often, and in many cases here, it's something to do with policing. It's the misuse of police powers, or the perceived misuse or overuse of police powers. It's the injury or death to people as a result of contact with the police, or it's if we go to 1981 and back to Brixton, it's the perceived consequences, the exacerbation of existing tensions as a consequence of specific policing policies or police operations. So the police tend to be found, as it were, close to the scene of the crime, as it were, if we're thinking of the flashpoints that tend to or are thought to precede riots in some sort of way. But they're also there, of course, in a more generalised way, I think, in amongst those, to use that word again, grievances that, when asked, people will express when talking about their motivations or their rationalisations of their motivations, depending on how you want to see this. So those would be at least some of the kind of general characteristics and commonalities that I think come out of some of the literature, some of what we think we know about the riots of this previous period. So back to 2011. 2011 riots are quite interesting academically, I think, because there's been just a lot of stuff written, interestingly. If you look back at many of these other riots, people have written quite a lot about Brixton, but if you went to Google Scholar and did a search on Toxteth and the riots, you wouldn't find a great deal. The same would be true of Handsworth in Birmingham or Moss Side in Manchester. You'd find bits and pieces, but not a lot. There were a couple of semi-official inquiries in Manchester and in Birmingham, but not in Liverpool. There wasn't a lot of academic. Broadwater Farm, even. So Broadwater Farm, where PC Keith Blakelock was murdered. So, you know, one of the most significant events in policing and public order in the post-war period. Has been really very little, actually, I would say, written in terms of analysis of that. 2011, absolutely not. This may be the ref or something else, I don't know, the kind of outpouring of stuff. I'm not alone in not having a life and apparently writing quite a lot. You know, there's just stuff pouring out all over the place. And sure enough, it poured out in relation to the 2011 riots, and we were a part of that kind of industry as well. What are the academic analysis of the... I call it academic analysis. I could be really rude at this point and say most of it's not academic analysis at all. But anyway, you didn't hear me say it. Academic speculation on the one hand and academic analysis in some points in the other. What did it have to say? Well, again, I think it pointed at many of the same things. People found and or speculated that these were highly deprived communities and people involved in the riots. There was a strong sense of marginalisation. The anger with the police and the reaction to the killing of Mark Duggan was, as it were, a kind of central impetus to the kicking off of the riots. That it was a broader anger with social and political elites in relation to other things that had been going on at the time. And then interestingly, one of the kind of you wouldn't necessarily quite call it a debate, but at least one of the points of disagreement, I guess, in the academic field around this was the role of consumerism. So there were academics from a variety of sources who took the view, largely following Zygmunt Bauman, that the nature of our late modern social world is one in which we've shifted from that old style kind of Marxist assumption about the nature of industrial capitalism, where we're all defined by our role in the means of production, to a late modern world in which we're all consumers, essentially. We're all defined by our relationship to markets. We're all consumers in one form or another. And the argument in some circles was based particularly on the visibility of looting in the 2011 riots, that actually these were riots of consumption. These were riots of consumerism. The young people, others, were out on the streets because they were, to use a variety of forms of terminology, they were failed or flawed consumers or so. But this was shopping for free, Christmas come early. It wasn't about politics, it wasn't about social conditions, it wasn't a reaction to marginalisation or mistreatment and so forth. It was fundamentally, or not much about those things, but this is fundamentally about the nature of modern consumer capitalism. There are others. including me, who would disagree somewhat with that position. But anyway, these were, I think, the kind of the broad themes in academic writing around there are others besides, but academic things around the 2011 riots. Now, I'm not going to say a great deal about this project. I'm happy to do so in questions after if anyone would like me to expand. But I feel I've talked about this project quite a lot, really, and people may already have heard some of this. So just a word or two about this project, and I'll move on. So in the immediate aftermath of the riots, the Guardian newspaper, which had been very heavily involved in the reporting of the riots, and as newspapers increasingly now do, given the nature of the journalistic world, were involved in the collection of huge amounts of data and were confronted with what to do with it, really. So beyond the kind of standard reportage approach to journalism, there was the what's the long read, what's the longer term investment that a newspaper can now make in terms of understanding this story of public interest. And they came across an example from the United States from the 1960s in Detroit, as it happens, where journalists and academics had partnered up to do quick, to use the modern parlance, impactful social research on the Detroit riot. And the Guardian thought, great, well, that would be a good idea. And they started casting around for an academic partner. And one way or another, anyway, that became me. So the LSE and the Guardian did a study which in the end lasted about 10 months. But the initial phase of which lasted about 3 months. And the intention was to try to fill in what we took to be, what we saw to be, at the time at least, the most significant gap in what was known about the riots, which was lots of people were talking about Tottenham and Brixton and wherever else around the country and the disorder that had occurred. And the voices that one heard the loudest and the most frequently, very understandably in many ways, were senior politicians of various stripes, senior police officers, other members of the the criminal justice elite, and then to a lesser extent, those who might think of themselves as victims of or affected by the riots, people living in the communities in which the worst damage and destruction and violence had occurred, and their voices were also heard, at least to a degree, though I think they probably still felt fairly invisible much of the time. There are many other voices that weren't heard, but the most obvious of which, it seemed to us, was, well, actually, frankly, the rioters, the people out on the streets doing this stuff. So we set about a project to try to interview them. Not the easiest task in the world. In a very short period of time, we interviewed 270 people out on the streets of various cities around England, doing standard sort of social scientific, open-ended, largely unstructured. Let's call them semi-structured, but with the emphasis on semi-unstructured probably here. Interviews lasting between 40 minutes and about an hour and a half, and then analysing the data in all the usual ways. So we started by asking them, basically by saying to them, so how did you first hear about the riots or whatever was going on? I can't remember precisely what it was. And then getting them from there, basically to talk us through the events from their perspective. How did they first hear about it? What did they then do? How did they come to be out on wherever they were, which streets and for how long and doing what and so forth. So again, and going back to my earlier point, our preoccupation was really still about the causes of the riots. We may not have called it that. I mean, we wanted to know what people were doing and what they thought they were doing. How did they understand it themselves? How did they make sense of it, I guess? And not that we would use these words, to what extent, what was their motivation? And what was their reaction subsequently? So, and I won't deal with this in any detail, I'm happy to come back to it. I mean, just in terms of the basic themes of what people said to us about why they were doing the things that they were doing, the 6 main themes that I draw out are these 6 on the board here. The first was excitement. The thing that gets lost in accounts of rioting in terms of who's out on the streets doing the stuff that they're doing is just how damn exciting it all is. It's a carnival. Yeah, briefly at least, it's a great cultural carnival in which all bets are off, normal social rules break down, and all those things that you've really wanted to do, like torch a police car, you can finally do. Great, whoopee. Dead exciting, fantastic. Secondly, there was all this stuff about consumerism and getting goods, but it wasn't just consumerism. In many cases, people were talking about basic everyday necessities. Actually, they were taking advantage of a situation to avail themselves of things they needed. Now, that would range from things like toilet rolls all the way through to flat screen televisions. It's the flat screen televisions that people generally remember and think about, but actually, for many people involved, by no means all, some of those involved were actually engaged in, frankly, much more basic, much more mundane forms of theft, if you like. Yeah, the shutters went up and they grabbed stuff. Yeah. Empowerment and revenge, the biggest gang, and they always get away with it. This concerned 2 of those things I was talking about before, which was in every location there we spoke to people, they expressed a really deep anger towards the police. So it was absolutely clear for a significant proportion of those with whom we spoke that actually their experience of life involved relationships with local police officers that were, to put it mildly, poor. Yeah, and this was something that led them momentarily to feel that that kind of phrase I used earlier about all bets are off and so on and so forth, the brief kind of sense of power that young people had, especially young people had out on the streets as the riots raged, were used in part to gain what they talked about as revenge upon the police. That briefly, as it were, the manor was theirs. Yeah? And that they could push people around, in this case, push cops around, or throw bricks at them, or do whatever else they were going to do, attack them, thereby turning the tables on a kind of institution and a force that they felt unreasonably, rightly or wrongly, unreasonably constrained and moulded their lives. Yeah. Now, one of the kind of central government bits of rhetoric in all this was about gangs. One of the big bits of public policy initiative in all of this was both Cameron and Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, obviously now Prime Minister, placed great emphasis on gangs and the idea that gangs were involved in the riots. There's absolutely no evidence of gangs being involved in the riots at all, apart from a couple of very small incidents. There's no organisation of that sort at all. To the extent that there was any organisation, it wasn't by gangs, it was by social media. But to the extent that the word gang appears anywhere in any of the transcripts of the interviews, it's in relation to the police. The phrase that's used, the biggest gang, is used of the police. And the revenge was against this gang, this all-powerful institution, yeah, which was in the background to these actually rather miserable lives that young people were living. All of this overlaying, both in relation to the police and other elites, government and so forth, was this sense of they always get away with it. So far as the rioters, or anyway, our respondents were concerned, the world that they described was a world of moral double standards. Yeah? Their sense was that the rules that applied to them, or the expectations that were placed upon them, or the reactions to their conduct when they did things out of line, however serious or not, were not imposed on others. Which is to say, their sense was the police and politicians and people involved in the financial world could behave in the most egregious ways and yet actually be insulated from punishment, insulated from any kind of, generally speaking, negative reaction. And they talked in detail about the financial crash, extraordinarily enough. Yeah? Talked about the MP's expenses scandal at Westminster, and talked about the kind of day-to-day street behaviour of some cops that they came into contact with, and said that, you know, we are constantly watched, we are constantly monitored, we are constantly stopped. You step out of line and the reaction is really severe. It just isn't the same world for people who are rich and powerful. Yeah? They can behave in the most appalling ways, and yet there's no retribution, there's no punishment, there's no reaction. And their sense was, this is a desperately unfair world. And actually it's a world that's getting worse. We live lives of limited opportunities, opportunities that are being further restricted. Often seemingly it felt deliberately as a result of public policy, which was targeted on their communities, communities that were already poor, that were already marginalised, and whose future was almost certain to get worse. And then at the end of this, there was this nothing to lose. I've already talked about this more than I meant to, but I'll tell this story, which one or two people may have heard, but I'll tell it once again. So at the end of this first phase of reading the riots, when we were reporting on these interviews with the rioters themselves, we made a film, or The Guardian and the BBC jointly made a film. So we, on the day of publication, the first day of publication of the results of this bit of the study, BBC Two's Newsnight programme was devoted to the project. And the bulk of the programme, chaired by Jeremy Paxman, was a round table interview of about 6 of us. So politicians, police officers, me, 1 or 2 other people. But preceding it, there was a film. And the film basically was a small number of people. It's still on the web, and I'll put the link up later. It was a small number of people who we had interviewed, who had been re-interviewed by the BBC anonymously. So they were all, their voices were changed and their faces were screened out and so forth. Obviously, we'd done all these interviews on the basis of complete anonymity. Anyway, one of the young people who was re-interviewed in this film, again, they asked him to run them through what he'd been involved in. And he tells this extraordinary story of hearing about the riots when he was off on holiday. He was abroad. He hears about the riots and he says, I've got to get back. I've got to get back. I can't miss this opportunity. This is just too good an opportunity. It's once in a lifetime. I've got to get back. So he packs in his holiday, he goes home, it's out onto the streets of London. So he's there on the second day or whatever it is. And for the next 36, 48 hours, he's involved in pretty much the whole gamut, the whole range of destructive, violent behaviours that were visible during the riots. He's involved in the looting. He's involved in, he torches a police car. Yeah, he attempts to set fire to buildings. He attacks police officers. Yeah, some of the worst acts that are described, he describes. Yeah, he's really at the extreme end of what's going on here. It's about 23 years old, 24 years old. Yeah. Towards the end of this, he talks about attacking a female police officer and says at one stage when it could have been a lot worse, but he decided to stop because she was a woman. And he tells this story as if someone's going to pat him on the back for this, like, thank you very much. But at the end of going through all of this eye-watering stuff, the interviewer says, so looking back on it all now, how do you feel about it? And he says, looking back on it now, it was probably, I quote, the best 3 days of my life. Now, interpretable in a variety of different ways, but it does seem to me that among other things that one might say about it, that's a reflection of the most profound source or form of alienation. If you can get to the age of 23 or 24 and the best things that have happened to you in your life are taking advantage of the opportunity to engage in violence and destruction, then frankly you've missed out on all those things that most of us would assume would form central components of the lives of, or the life of any young citizen in our country. So that's kind of, I didn't mean to go into quite so much detail, but that's kind of what Reading the Riots had to say. So I think, great though I personally think the project was and all the rest of it, and we did a lot more besides in the second phase of the study. Nonetheless, at least we, I think, also partially fell into the first trap here, which is to say, so I don't know really whether this is 3 problems or 4, but 3 or 4 problems of riots research. The first one, I think, as I've said before, is we remain somewhat fixated on causes. Now, this is problematic, I think, in at least 2 ways. First of all, I'm not sure we can ever really discover what the causes of riots are. Yeah, we can get some sense post hoc, looking back at the social conditions, people's understandings, their motivations, the interactions between authorities and people on the street. We can build up a picture, I think, of the kind of the nature and unfolding of disorder as it worsens. People have done some very good research precisely to do those things. But do those things have predictive power? Not really, I don't think. I think they're fine post hoc, but predictively not really. So the best you might ever think, to use a kind of parallel description, we might ever be in a place to do in relation to riots is to think about risk and protective factors, or some kind of thing. Yeah, some similar. We use that as a metaphor for this. Useful and absolutely the sort of thing we should be doing. But always, I think we ought to be careful about how far we might be able to go with that. But the second real problem with this, and I'll come back to this shortly, is that I think the kind of fixation with causes diverts attention from other questions, and other questions which are arguably at least as important. And I'll come back to that shortly. Secondly, I think we're still somewhat hamstrung by this rationality-irrationality schism or dichotomy. Yeah? And that, well, no, let me park that because I'm using too much time and come back to that shortly as well. Thirdly, I think actually studies of riots tend to be very, very narrow. In the main, there is relatively little stroke no comparative research on riots. So I've put up an honourable exception here by Francis, whose book is called Riot, Unrest and Protest on the Global Stage, but I think even Francis would accept it's not truly a comparative study. It's a set of individual reflections and chapters from around the world which allows a kind of comparative sense to develop from it, more than it is strictly a set of comparative studies in itself. But it's pointing us, at least, and it's one of the very few things that does, it's pointing us in the direction I think we should be thinking more of in relation to the studies of riots, which is how do we understand these things across the globe, or beyond our own jurisdiction. And then finally, and this is why I say, well, I don't know whether it's 3 or 4, but let's call it back to 3. It's back to my first point, which is I think that our fixation, as it were, but the ways in which we tend to do research on riots tends to lead us to treat these as partial social phenomena. They're not fully formed and rounded social phenomena, which is to say, I think they have a life beyond violence, which is what I'm going to come on to. Indisputably, they have a life beyond violence, and they should have a life beyond violence so far as we're concerned social scientifically as well. So what time should I be wrapping up? I always overshoot. I've done about 35? Yeah, 10 or 15, we're okay. Is everyone, it's very warm in here. It's especially warm, I've got this on because I'm got the microphone in my pocket, so it's especially warm. But if anyone needs to open the door or anything and cool down a little, shall I open the door? It is warm. Okay, so 10 minutes. So let me go on to the final few slides. Sort of comparative, just tiny bit of very superficial comparative stuff. So, in order to reorient our concerns, as I say, I'm not at all convinced that this is necessarily the best or appropriate terminology, but what I want to propose is a life cycle model of riots, which is to say, I think we should be interested not just in those things which form the backdrop, to riots. So the context, whether that context be its structural context, its political context, its cultural context, and so forth. We ought also to be involved in, interested much more specifically in the dynamics of riots. So not just how they start, but then how they develop and how they spread or diffuse. And more so, we should also be interested in why they and how they end, which is not a question that's ever much explored, I think. But there's actually reasonably strong evidence, I think, and this is a bit more speculative, but I think there's reasonably strong evidence that the 2011 English riots, at least in part, came to an end because of the response of the police and the criminal justice system. It's not necessarily a comfortable message for some, but I think the very large numbers of police officers deployed on the streets of the capital and other cities, together with actually, which is something I'll come back to again in a minute, the very extreme response of the penal system, played, I think, actually quite could argue to have played quite a significant role in bringing the violence to an end. Now, I suspect it wasn't by any means the only factor, but it's one. And certainly the ending of riots is something we should be thinking about. But then the nature of riots. So beyond policing, we need to think, I think, a little more carefully about participation and motivation. That ought to be, and again, this may not be quite the right terms, but be thinking about how these things differ in different contexts and different forms of disorder and so forth. But most particularly, and the thing that I'll come back to in a moment, is the bit of the model that we need to build in is the response to riots. And not just the response at the time of the violence, but the response in the aftermath, once the fires have died down and people have stopped chucking bricks and various other things. What's the public, media, political and policy response to riots? Yeah. Because these things have very real impacts, as I say. I'll come back to that in a moment. So, okay, let me do it very briefly. I'm going to run out of time. But so just applying this and thinking very briefly about in what way do the 2011 riots look different from those other riots that were on the slide at the beginning that occurred in the 36 years or whatever it was, 34 years prior to the 2011 riots? Well, there are at least 3 or 4 key differences, I think. The first is, or the last, depending on which way we go, is the one I've just been mentioning, which is the reaction of what I'd call the penal state is very significantly different in the 2011 riots than it is in any of the previous instances of post-war public order or riots, civil violence. Significantly greater. I'll come back to that momentarily. Secondly, the standard political response to all riots up until 2011, any major riot, including Bristol in 1980. So Bristol in 1980, there was a police raid on a cafe in St Paul's in Bristol. Slowly but surely, a conflagration got worse and worse and worse. It turned into a huge amount of rioting, so violent and so unprepared were the police to deal with it, that the local commander, well, indeed the chief constable in the end, gave an order to withdraw. Yeah? Unheard of in post-war policing history. A police chief withdrew the police from a particular area. Such was the danger to his officers. Yeah? The next day, the Home Secretary stood up in Parliament and did what all Home Secretaries have done on all of these occasions and said, what a very fine man the Chief Constable is, what an excellent body of people these police officers are, what all these people need is our unstinting support in the face of this terrible violence. That's the job of the politicians. The politician, the Home Secretary in particular, is to stand behind the police service, yeah, at times of need like this, when they're on the front line dealing with the first sort of worst forms of violence. Snap forward to 2011, nothing of the sort. Our political leaders to a person got up and were rude to the police, frankly, in a variety of ways. said they hadn't handled it well, that they were too slow, that there weren't sufficient officers out on the streets, and that actually it was only by dint of the intervention of the good officers of the Prime Minister that in the end enough officers were managed to be deployed onto the streets to bring an end to the violence. It was a real change it was a real illustration of the changed territory of the politics of policing at the time. Three other quick things. These were mixed race riots, if you like. Yeah, very large numbers of young white people out on the streets. These were not race riots. These were not riots about. This was not the reaction of local black communities, as it were, to the police. It was much more complicated and much more ethnically diverse than most of, or many of, the previous outbreaks we've seen. It unfolded much more quickly than most of the disorder that we've seen on the mainland in the post-war period. So it went from one small, relatively small area of North London on a Saturday night to 16, 17, 26, 36 locations around the country in a period of a couple of days. And then finally, there is the question of looting and whether the nature of the violence, did it look different, and was it different in the 2011 riots? Well, as I've said, open to debate. So very quickly, on international comparisons, and I'm going to do two very, very swiftly, and then I promise, shut up. So, England versus France and England versus Sweden. France, 2005, three young men of African origin are on their way home from a football match. They haven't got identification papers on them. They spot the police. They know that they're in trouble if they get pulled over because they've not got their ID papers, so they run. The police see them running, the police chase them. The boys climb into an electricity substation in order to hide, and bingo. Someone touches a live wire. All three get electrocuted, 2 die. The police go away, leave them there. Okay. Protests occur. The then Interior Minister, Michel Sarkozy, comes out and says a whole bunch of really very rude things about the, in inverted commas, scum who inhabit the banlieue around the peripheries of Paris and who are responsible for this violence and so forth. Eventually, rioting breaks out. It spreads to 300 localities around France over a period of 3 weeks. Yeah, it's huge. Sweden, 2013, police are called to an incident. A man is said to be carrying a sword or some other large implement and is holding someone hostage, or at least that's what they say has occurred. The man dies. Turns out subsequently that actually he had a knife, but it wasn't a sword at all. It was just a common garden kitchen knife. There was no hostage. That was his wife. It simply seems to, in retrospect, seems to have been a case, just a very, very badly handled domestic case. Again, leading to smallish scale riots around Stockholm, lasting about 4 or 5 days. Didn't spread beyond that. But look, I picked them not because I think they're necessarily kind of terribly illustrative. These aren't necessarily the most important cases, but they just allow, I think, me to play with this life cycles model and say, so how do these kinds of cases, to what extent do they look similar or different from each other? And I won't go through the whole thing. I'll maybe just pick out 2 or 3 things. So the first thing I think that's really, where there are similarities and differences, is in both France and Sweden, we're talking about communities where there are very significant numbers of second-generation immigrants to those countries and to those cities, primarily from Africa. They're not well integrated in different ways. And those communities themselves are quite socially segregated from other parts of Paris and Stockholm and so forth. To a certain extent, there's some similarities there, but they're both very different from what was going on in England. In England, we're not talking about communities which are socially segregated and ethnically segregated in that kind of way at all. Yeah? Nor are we talking about, in the main, second-generation immigrants. In fact, quite the reverse. And as I say, actually, we're talking about quite ethnically diverse involvement in the riots anyway. But the big differences, I think, lie in the response. In the political response in Sweden is quite different from that in England and in France. Actually, although there are some kind of slightly reactionary statements made in Sweden, in the main, most of them are rather more what one might expect of the kind of Nordically exceptionalist countries, and they're kind of somewhat less punitive justice systems and political systems than we're perhaps used to in other parts of Western Europe. Whereas in France, and particularly in England, the reaction of the penal state was very much more extensive and punitive and significant. A small but interesting one, and for anyone who's interested in cultural criminology, there are some interesting papers to be written, I think, almost certainly not by me in this case. But there is a style to rioting. Yeah? There is a preferred mode of protest, depending on where you're from. Yeah? If you're French, or indeed to a degree, if you're Swedish, it seems, you burn cars. Burning cars is the way to protest. Yeah? Thousands and thousands and thousands of cars were burnt, torched during the French riots. English riots? Nah. We burn some cars, but that's not the symbol. Yeah? Now, I'm not quite sure what the English symbol is, but clearly in 2011, one of the things that distinguished, at least partially distinguished the nature of the rioting there was looting. Yeah? People were engaging in looting on a far more significant scale, a far more widespread scale in the English riots in 2011 than it did in any of the French or Swedish examples. Sweden was more difficult. People weren't necessarily near shops in quite the same way. But France, looting didn't seem to be nearly the same thing. So for anyone who's looking for a little pathway to nice small studies, I'd be fascinated if someone could tell me a little bit more about, as it were, the kind of cultural politics of protest. So, very fine. The final example, and I will shut up then. So, the reaction to riots, the life cycle. I think that we need to think of disorder in the round and build into our picture as social scientists of riots what happens in the aftermath in at least these three ways. Yeah? What is the political reaction? The political reaction is really important in a whole variety of ways, but not least because it frames our understanding of the riots. In the absence of other primary defining vehicles, like an official inquiry or someone of the stature of Lord Justice Scarman, the primary definers for riots become our political elites. And the ways, the words they use, the language they use, and the things they decide to say tends to have a profound impact on what happens subsequently, not least in relation to public policy. The reaction to riots by politicians frames what happens in relation to policy, and more particularly whether anything happens at all. So actually, and to put it at its very simplest, it would be of very little surprise that a government that described the 2011 riots as criminality pure and simple and in various similarly kind of cognate ways actually had almost no public policy response to the riots at all. Showed no interest actually in responding directly in a policy-making way to what was going on in those communities and what had happened out on the streets. And then finally, as I say, there's the response of the penal state. It seems to me, for criminologists, it's particularly surprising, actually, that we've paid hitherto relatively little attention to what our penal system has done in response to major outbreaks of disorder. So, the two examples, and I'll do 1 minute on each and I'll stop. So London, the aftermath. Yeah, riots don't end when the violence ends. The consequences carry on. If you live in any of those communities, the riots are still a present feature for you. Your neighbourhood has been lastingly affected by that violence in a variety of ways. First of all, huge numbers of young people were swept up and imprisoned. Yeah? There was a spike. There was a spike in our prison population in late 2011 and early 2012, almost certainly and almost entirely as a consequence of the reaction to the riots. The custody rate in the aftermath of the riots was 3 to 4 times the rate for the same offences in the previous year. And not only were you 3 to 4 times more likely to be imprisoned for exactly the same offence during the course of the riots, but the prison sentence that you would get would be between 2 to 3 times the length. So the reaction of the penal state, just on that level, on that superficial level, was extraordinary. As I've said, and I won't go into this detail here, the public policy response was almost non-existent. Yeah? Government did next to nothing, and even when it did do something, the so-called Troubled Families Initiative, actually the riots were a smokescreen. The riots were actually just a post hoc rationalisation of a pre-existing policy initiative, not a response, a substantive response to the riots at all. So finally, Australia, and a tiny little case. So I'll finish with this. This is a case in Melbourne from last year. Downtown Melbourne, Federation Square, in the centre of a very lovely Australian city, has an annual festival called the Moomba Festival. In a couple of years, 2015, 2016, the Moomba festivals had a certain amount of violence, bit of trouble. 2017, there was the so-called Moomba Riot. The Moomba Riot basically was, so far as I can discern, a group of no more than a few dozen young men causing trouble. There was some sporadic violence, there was disorder, the police got called in, there was crowds being moved out of the way. A lot of this was caught on film. Some arrests were made, people were prosecuted, got called a riot. By any kind of normal standards, I would say you wouldn't think of it as a riot. It's the sort of thing that wasn't much bigger or much worse than any experienced police officer might well come across on a Friday or Saturday night in major urban centres, including Portsmouth, I'd hazard. Yeah, it was nothing like, but it got called a riot. It got called a riot, and the reaction to it is still going on up to and including this week. There have been political statements made this week about that riot. Now, essentially what this involved is young people from the South Sudanese community in Melbourne. Melbourne had taken in quite a large number of people in the immigration wave earlier in the 21st century, when people fleeing from the civil wars in sub-Saharan Africa were given home in Australia. As often happens, that movement of peoples is not unproblematic. And the allegations in the aftermath of the Moomba riot, quote unquote, was that this was conflict between African gangs. And that African gangs were out of control, that there was a really serious problem with African youth, and what it needed was a concerted change in the operation of Victorian juvenile justice, the state's juvenile justice system. They shifted responsibility from juvenile justice from essentially a kind of welfare department of government into the Ministry of Justice, shifting it in a more punitive direction. Made a whole series of other, at least putative changes to the youth justice system. Certainly the punitive rhetoric surrounding juvenile crime has become much worse, and as I say, is going on. It's had some very serious consequences, also within the South Sudanese community, where the relationships between the young African men and the elders in the community have become very strained. Now, my argument is just a very simple one, that something which actually on the surface doesn't really look like a riot, but which for one set of reasons or another got called a riot, has had and continues to have lasting consequences for those communities and for the people caught up in it. And it simply, I hope, reinforces my point that riots as social phenomena have lives beyond violence. Yeah? The life beyond violence we may not think of as riot, but certainly as a social phenomenon, yeah, it's very much part of that period in which the violence existed. So I think I'll stop there rather than going through this slide, but I'm happy to talk about any of these final points I was going to make, but they're mainly reiterating stuff I've already said. And so I've well and truly outstayed my welcome, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, just if Tim's happy to, opportunity for a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Slip away. Throw it open to the floor.
Everyone's exhausted.
I'm interested in the work with The Guardian and how feasible that would be now in today's climate, as far as print news and having the resources to produce an enormous amount of data, which was what they were doing at the time and directly afterwards. Yeah. Do you think that is something that is likely to be able to ever be done again?
That's a very good question, and thank you. I mean, I genuinely don't know, but I mean, I think the kind of thrust of your question is and the implication of it is the right one, probably, which is that I think it's unlikely. I mean, we raised money for the research from research foundations. So the research foundations paid for the bulk of it, but no, it's right to say that the Guardian invested significant resources in the project, as the LSE did too. Would they do it now? I suspect it would be difficult in a variety of ways, not just in sort of material resources, but also human resources. I mean, newspapers, I mean, my sense of them now is, increasingly the kind of core staff is shrinking, and the bulk of what one sees is freelancers, of one sort or another. And to do this kind of work, you need at least a small number of semi-permanent staff. You need people with a history in the newspaper, but also more than that, you need, and in this case, the Guardian lead was the person who was their then special projects editor. You need someone who has the trust of the editorial team. So, he was able to persuade the then editor, Alan Rushbridger, and others that this was a worthwhile investment. But unless you have people with that history in the newspaper, I don't think one would even get the question asked in the first place. And so notwithstanding, even if there were the material resources, financial resources, I'm not sure you'd persuade anyone to deploy them anymore.
It's just that when we're talking about information literacy to students about criminology, the news is something that they do look to. Yeah. And I just feel that the surety of any reasonably good news is getting less and less. Yeah. And the Guardian example was really a brilliant example in terms of offering a lot of research material for people to look at.
No, absolutely. But, I mean, could this kind of project be done again? Yes, I think it could, but it'd have to be done slightly differently, I think, which is to say, and I would hope it might be at one stage. And I do think that there's a lot of mileage for academic journalistic collaboration. So, I mean, not a question you were asking, but a parallel one, which is, I think academics and journalists bring different but compatible and sympathetic skills and interests to that kind of task. Could a university have done that study on its own? I don't think so. Could a newspaper have done that study on its own? I don't think so. I actually think it's a much better thing for the collaboration. I mean, we could all have done something good, I hope, separately, but it would have been different and not so exciting.
Thank you.
What research goes into people's behaviour pre-riot to look at what determining factors there might be?
So is the question, so do people do research before riots happen, or do we look back at those people and...
After the riots,
Yeah.
take place and you can identify who actually was part of them. Is there any research into their behaviour pre-riot to see what warning signs there might well be?
Well, I mean, there's very little research of this sort. But if you begin to think about how you might do that kind of research, you fairly quickly see that it's quite problematic to achieve. So, in order to do something robust and successful, what you'd ideally want is a representative sample of rioters, yeah? Which of course you're never going to get. So you're immediately hampered by, is it possible to get hold of a group of people who look in any way representative of who was out on the streets? Answer, that's quite tricky. So you do what we did, which is you try to interview as many as possible, thereby at least hoping that you generate something that's kind of plausible.
I would think they'd be quite forthcoming because it's something that they typically are quite happy to talk about.
Well, you'd think possibly, but I think you'd also think maybe not. If you think of the context of the riots, so we were doing the research in October and November 2011, so about 6 to 8 weeks after the riots. We were interviewing people who hadn't been arrested. And by definition, if they were involved in this thing I'm called rioting, but the disorder, by definition they were admitting to more or less serious criminal offences. Yeah? That's actually a very risky thing to do. I mean, I was really surprised. I thought the reverse of you, in fact. I actually thought people wouldn't talk to us at all. And the only other project that was done at the time, which was a government-funded project by NatCen, National Centre for Social Research, actually had a very low response rate. They got very few interviews. So people, I think, would be understandably cagey about talking about admitting to behaviour that would, if prosecuted, would lead to lengthy prison sentences. But the other side of that is, it would be, the obvious way to get a sample would be a sample of people who are arrested. Yeah? And there is research, there was some very good research done by, mainly by the Ministry of Justice, but also by the Home Office and by the Department of Work and Pensions and so on. I don't know who behind the scenes persuaded them to do this, but they did some very good research looking at the kind of social, demographic and educational backgrounds of the people who'd been arrested in the riots. And that tells us some very interesting things and reinforces starkly, certainly as far as the young people are concerned, the very, very disadvantaged, very marginalised backgrounds from which they came. But how do we know that the people who are arrested are in any way representative of that broader population who were involved in rioting? There's good reason to suspect they're not. Yeah, and one of the things, there's good reason to suspect they're not, for the simple reason that, why were they arrested? Yeah, well, if they were arrested because they were up to no good and they were stopped from doing their up to no goodness by a police officer and carted away in a van, then so far so good. But if they were arrested because they're known, yeah, because they've had previous contact with the police, because they're arrested after the fact, then that's different. And what you then get is, as it were, the usual suspects. Yeah? That's not problematic in policing terms necessarily, but in research terms it's deeply problematic, because it doesn't tell you whether those who are not known to the police are different from, they probably are different from those who are. So you're always struggling, I think, with getting to a group of people who will tell you anything solid about those questions.
Yeah. You very rarely will ever get anyone arrested at that stage because they would have been told don't arrest.
That's, well, and that was one of the sources of controversy, I think. You know, the political conflict around the policing of the riots in the early days, when Theresa May and David Cameron were being, quite highly critical of the Metropolitan Police response in particular. And indeed there was public criticism as well. That public criticism was as it were, of the police standing back, letting people loot shops and do various other things. Now, to the unobserved or untrained eye, it might look like police officers standing back, letting people loot shops, but as I think you were kind of implying, there are good reasons for not making arrests under those circumstances. You make an arrest, you tie up a lot of police officers. Actually, your job is to try to maintain order in some kind of way, or not to allow things to escalate. Now, it could be that making arrests would be the solution to that, but in a position where there's a quickly unfolding, really serious public order situation, the making of large numbers of arrests is probably not the road you're going to go down, I think. I think you're right.
The thing is, I'm sorry, it's just I was a police officer in 2011.
Right.
And I think...
Where were you?
In Portsmouth.
In Portsmouth, sorry.
Portsmouth.
Yeah.
But police officers had all their leave cancelled on extended hours.
Yeah.
But despite the fact that we didn't have any direct action taking place in Portsmouth, it was anticipated.
Yeah, yeah.
If you spoke to the police, they would have been able to tell you quite a way in advance of this happening that things were approaching that point.
Yeah.
Which is why I asked whether any research was done about behaviour prior to the riots taking place, because the best source of information in relation to predicting disorder are the police.
Well, yes and no. I think they're one good source of information about likely problems, but actually, in many cases, it's an awful term, but for want of a better one, it's community leaders who are the other really important source of intelligence about likely trouble. And so there were some very good case studies, a couple of case studies, one in places where, as it were, full-scale rioting didn't take place, so a bit like Portsmouth. So in both Bristol and Leeds, both cities with a history of riots, in communities where there's been this sort of thing previously, in both in St Paul's, in Bristol, in Chapeltown in Leeds, they came fairly close to it all kicking off. But it didn't in the end. They managed, for different reasons in both cases, to kind of keep a lid on it. But I would say in both of those cases, the kind of the sources, the absolutely key, especially in Leeds, the key sources of information about what might happen, where it might happen, who might be involved, what the kind of danger signals were, and actually how some of those things might be mitigated, were community workers of one sort or another, often working with the police. But I think there's another source of intelligence there too. Sorry.
Firstly, I want to thank you for your time here.
Well, thank you.
Secondly, during the interviews you had with the riot,
Yeah.
your research, did you find any sort of trend significantly pointing to the lack of communication between either public or marginalized groups and the state, which could be like even police or councils or any other authorities? Did you find any sort of trend in their response?
In what the young people were saying, or the?
Yes.
Well, I think they were saying precisely that. I think, by and large, you're talking here about people who, if they were of school age, then they were in the main failing educationally. They were already, or they were close to, exclusion from school, or they were already in some form of special education facility. If they were of working age, most of them were not working, or many of them were not working and were drawing benefits. But the things that they were expressing were their sense of, I think, for want of a better description, their sense of disenfranchisement, their sense of being cut off from what you might think of as the mainstream, whatever that might be. So communication, I think I don't know what we mean by communication here, but I think, a lot of the time the communication they felt they got from the authorities was cuff around the ear at best. It wasn't. These weren't politically engaged people in that way. They were politically engaged in other ways.
The reason why I asked that for some riots, I like to believe that if there are open ways for the marginalized groups to talk about their concerns, because sometimes in some countries the government say you cannot go and just have a riot, but if you ask for permission for a peaceful one, they'll not give it to you, but that's not always the case. So that's why I asked how much that lack of communication was a concern to those people. So if that was provided, would that right still happen?
I don't think it would have been top of their list. I mean, I think you're right. You know, I think so. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, having a voice in some sort of way, I think, is hugely important. And I think, you know, I, by and large, I think we're talking about people who didn't feel that they had a voice in those places where, you know, it might count in some kind of way. But nor do they have all those other things that you might think that citizens would desire or deserve, even. So, you know, the kind of they were living in communities that were you know, in London, the poorest wards in the poorest boroughs of London, often. Communities where the kind of basic facilities, like, you know, everything from youth clubs to after-school clubs to parenting groups, to the whole variety were being closed. Yeah, that already slim resources were being taken away from those communities, and they felt it. And that was one of the things that was quite interesting to me, and that, which tells you much more about me than it does about them, was, you know, young, often very young people would talk in a lot of detail about specific public policies, about the education maintenance allowance, yeah, about specific changes that were being made to youth provision in their borough. They would know about it, they would talk about it. They were actually, to that extent, actually quite highly politicised in ways that I hadn't expected. So yes, a voice, definitely they felt was lacking, but it was one of many things, I think, that were lacking in a context where those opportunities, already limited, were becoming less.
Okay, one more, and then I think.
Try to keep it short.
No,
Linking into that question, because I was thinking about, okay, when would a protest become a riot? And when you were mentioning that you thought consumerism was hypothesized to play a role, but doesn't always. When comparing what happened in London to what happened in France, you were focused a lot more on ethnicity in those cases. And I do wonder if, when people become considered a threat quicker, and people act differently as a result of that, that's a different type of anger. And I wonder if, like, London is a very expensive city, especially as a student.
Yeah.
You know, you could focus on why are they looting there and putting cars on fire somewhere else.
Yeah.
Couldn't the looting just be opportunistic? So there's no actual ideal behind it. It's just, I live in an expensive city and there's an opportunity here because there's unrest.
Yeah, it could be, but I don't think it's just that. No, I think you're absolutely right. But I think the question that you raise, the bigger question that you raise, is a really important one, which is so let's just take looting as one example of one form of violence that occurs in the context of riots. So one of the questions for us is, so how much goes on? What is looted? Which shops are looted? Yeah, by whom? Are there any places that aren't looted? It's quite interesting that in, where was it? I think it was Peckham. I think it was Peckham High Street in South London. There was a whole bunch of, you know, pound stores were looted, betting shops, electrical stores, jewellers, bookshop, untouched. The bloody youth of today, I say. Seriously, come on. So that raises all sorts of questions there. But then the bigger question of, so if we take looting, how do we understand looting? What kind of act is looting? Yeah? Is looting just opportunistic? Now clearly, and if we go back into our kind of criminological theory, yeah, we could see looting in standard rational choice ways. Yeah, Ron Clark and all the rest would be very happy to say, well, look, you know, that's the way to see this. There was an opportunity that was exploited. Yeah, actually, if you make these things more difficult, there'll probably be less of it. Yeah, we're not necessarily concerned from that perspective to understand the motivations beyond the kind of that broad sense of rationality. But actually, there's an awful lot more to looting. Some of it's clearly opportunistic. Absolutely. Did people see shutters up, stuff wander in without any kind of premeditation? Absolutely, they did. Did some people make shopping lists, take orders on their estates, go out deliberately to get goods in order to fulfill those orders? Absolutely, they did. Yeah. Did some people do it because they wanted the latest fashions, trainers and other stuff? Absolutely, they did. Did some people do it because they were hungry, as it were? I mean, in inverted commas. Yes, they did. Did some people do it because they were poor, straightforwardly, have very little in the way of material goods, and this was a chance to take some material goods that they would otherwise not have, which is a rather different act, I think, yes. But more broadly than that, and the thing that I think the kind of absolutely at its core, the sort of consumerism argument gets wrong, is that looting is both violent and political, I think, which is to say that it occurs in the context of violence. And it is in many ways also a violent act. It's not just theft. It's very different from standard shoplifting, I would say. Okay? But it's also, at least to a degree, not least because of the political context in which it takes place. And is experienced by some, by no means all, and not even a majority, but experienced by some, at least partially, as a form of resistance. Yeah, it sounds a bit grandiose, but it is. Yeah, it's a means of expressing, one means of expressing among many others, like torching police cars or throwing bricks or shouting nasty names and various other things. It's a means of expressing the anger and the frustration and the marginalisation that many felt, I think. It's all those things simultaneously, I think, as well as opportunistic.
Okay, well, I think we can continue this discussion if anyone wants to over a beer. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you all. Thank you.